Welcome back. Today we're going to be taking a look at Chapter 5, the decision-making processes. Chapter 5 takes the information and the principles from the previous 4 chapters, feelings and emotions, conclusive and process thinking, desires, wants, and have-tos, and understanding time, psychological time and chronological time, putting it together in a very pragmatic, practical system so that we can utilize this in our everyday decision-making in our activities. Okay, so I'd like to start with taking a look at Paradigm 1. Paradigm 1 here is pleasure versus pain. It's the instinctual paradigm. It's built into us to ask the question, is this going to give me pleasure? Is this going to give me pain? And we tend to want to maximize pleasure and minimize pain, which makes perfect sense. Why would we want to choose something painful? Well, the only reason we would do that is if there was some greater value operating out there that would override the experience of pain. But typically, in terms of body experience, we want to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. The problem here, though, is when we're talking about pleasure, pain in Paradigm 1, we're talking about the feelings primarily, feelings and emotions, but primarily the feelings. Okay? So when we talk about pain here, we're talking about those disturbing feelings like sadness, hurt, anger, frightened, bored, lonely. Feelings that give us that sense of discomfort and disturbance. Okay? So when it comes to these feelings of pain, or painful feelings, we don't want to minimize those. Why? Because these painful feelings are part of the intelligence system. The intelligence system of the body, the brain, and the universe. So we don't want to minimize these. We want to utilize these feelings to help us understand where our thinking is off and where it needs adjusting. So in Chapter 1, we took a look at Byron Katie's way of describing that, which I love. She puts it so beautifully. That all disturbing feelings signal that we're attaching to a thought, sentence in the brain, or a story in the mind that's at odds with reality in some way. Okay, there's denial going on, distortion, we're taking a fragment to be the whole thing, or fantasies replacing fact. So when we have these disturbing feelings here, that's when we put in our call to the editor, take a look at the story that's producing these feelings, and then edit that story. And as she puts it, when the work is to align thought with reality and truth. And when we do that, then we move in the direction of being more calm, peaceful, or at least neutral, because the function of the feeling is fulfilled. Again, in Chapter 1, we use the metaphor of the oil light on the dashboard of the car. When the oil light goes on, that's the signal. When these feelings take place, that's the signal that says, go into your engine and check your oil level and adjust that. The oil light goes out. When these feelings come, it's go into your brain, go into your story-making mind, and make the adjustment there, and then that's when these feelings will shift. So I want to point out here that the pleasure feelings like fun, being happy, powerful, secure, relieved, or excited, those are all positive things. Pleasure is a part of organic life, perfectly normal, perfectly natural, not a problem. It's only a problem when we would attempt to use a pleasurable feeling to replace or cover a painful feeling. Because then what are we doing? Then we're wiping out the intelligence system. So no, we don't want to maximize pleasure and minimize pain when it comes to these feelings. Okay? So let's use an example here. So we have a fellow, he's an alcoholic, and coming up on the end of the week, he's thinking of Friday, and he doesn't have any plans, so he's not sure what he's going to do. And when he's thinking of the empty evening, he's tendency to feel bored or lonely. Okay, and he doesn't like feeling bored or lonely. he wants to get rid of these feelings. So what he does is he decides to use alcohol to get relief. Right? So in other words, he's cutting out the positive function of these feelings. So instead of dealing with the feelings, understanding what's behind them, and working with them, he uses the alcohol to cover them over because he doesn't want to be lonely and bored. Okay? Now, what's happening there is he's thinking of himself only. What is my experience? Is it going to be pleasurable or painful? I don't want the pain, I want the pleasure. And when he's thinking about his choice, he's only thinking about his immediate experience, what I call now only here. What he's doing is he's forgetting that because of this use of alcohol to cover the painful feelings, he's ended up with 4 marriages, lost 3 jobs, has pancreatitis, gastritis, and not very happy. So the problem here is he doesn't understand the function of these negative feelings. He's isolating those feelings out, and basically, in this instance, he's isolating himself by staying at home rather than finding out what activities might be interesting or pleasurable. Now let's go back to chapter 1 again and take a look. The statement made in chapter 1, I sometimes forget, I hope it's in there, but if not, you're getting it here. Every negative feeling, every negative is negative because underneath it is a positive waiting to get acknowledged, expressed, or lived. Okay? So in this instance, what's in our conscious mind, consciousness is the negative, oh, I'm going to be bored and lonely. What's missing is the awareness that underneath that, in the unconscious, not yet brought to consciousness, is the positive waiting to be expressed or lived. So in this instance, you can only be bored if underneath the boredom is a desire for something interesting. Okay? You can only be lonely if underneath it is a desire for connection. So if we remove these, we're removing the positive, waiting to be acknowledged, expressed, or lived. So that's just like the division, the arithmetic division principle here, where you've got the numerator and denominator, and you take the 3 and bring it into the 6, and you get 2. You get something new. Okay, so that's the function of the negative feeling, to help inform us about those aspects of the way we're living our lives that are not being addressed or attended to. Okay. So the big problem is we're afraid of our painful feelings because we don't understand their positive function. And therefore we get stuck in repeating things over and over and over again because we're not addressing the underlying problem. When you use pleasure to cover pain, it's like being this ping pong ball here caught between the paddles of pleasure and pain, pleasure and pain, pleasure and pain. Why does the pain repeat? Because I'm not going into the positive underneath that's trying to get expressed. Okay? So what happens is when we use pleasure to cover pain and we end up in this repetition, we have a word for that, and it's called suffering. Suffering happens when we resist the pain, or we try to escape or avoid the pain, and we end up just repeating the same problem over and over and over again. Okay? So in this paradigm, when we use pleasure to cover pain, it's in a me only, now only state, and it isolates the positive, and often it isolates us from the positive parts of our life. Okay, so at this point I'm going to ask my friends here, and I forgot to introduce them. You don't see them now because they're behind the camera, but again, it's Raman and Josh are with us today, and they may have some things to say periodically as we go along. So, any comments, thoughts, questions so far?
Well, I can stand up here for a second. Hey everybody, I'm Josh. I mean, to me, this definitely makes sense so far. you know, I think definitely tracks from kind of chapter 1 and some of the earlier material. And I appreciate the part about kind of understanding and with the alcohol, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it could be alcohol, it could be food, it could be computer use.
Right, exactly.
Anything that would get us to try to cover over the negative through a positive, try to get relief.
Right, exactly. And the misunderstanding is that it actually doesn't really lead to relief, right? So
Right.
it's kind of a misguided way to seek relief,
Right.
right? And it's
Yeah.
and that's why with that alcohol example, there is actually no relief. In fact, the opposite happens, right?
Right.
Instead of relief, long term, there's health issues, relational issues,
Right, right.
and mental health issues.
Yes.
So that's, I think, part of the delusion and the misunderstanding of relief and trying to manage these feelings, right?
Right, so there's a delusion that it's gonna bring relief, because again, we're isolating, in that instance, we're isolating the positive moment of relief, but not recognizing that we're digging a hole deeper,
Exactly.
and we're actually creating suffering through time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So to me, that really makes sense. I really appreciate this too, kind of the unconscious, conscious, the bit of a duality there that is interesting to look at too. Yeah, because if you're just kind of at peace with being lonely, it just becomes sort of what is, and there's no problem.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
So with loneliness, there's this echo of that desire, which can be hard to pinpoint at times, right? What's under the surface there.
Yes, it could take a little work, and
Right.
we haven't gone into this yet, and maybe it was mentioned, I think the focusing process, which is a technique of paying attention to the
Right.
body sense of the whole of an issue or an experience, is one of the best ways to see what's underneath,
Right.
to uncover that.
Yeah, but this makes a lot of sense. Thanks for letting me jump up here for a second. So
Well, jump up anytime.
Okay.
And you too, Raman, if you have
Thank
something that you
you.
want to share, or,
Yes, of
Question?
course.
okay. So, we want to see another paradigm. We have paradigm 1 versus paradigm 2 here. So we want to take a look at paradigm 2 and what that involves. So paradigm 2 is order versus disorder. Just like here we have pleasure versus pain in paradigm 2, it's a higher cognitive operation. And so now we have order versus disorder. So what do we mean by order? Freedom from internal conflict. When we are free from internal conflict, we can say, I have order in my life. Now, one person I was sharing this with said, well, what about sociopaths? They don't have internal conflict. They just go ahead and do what they want to do and don't care about anybody else and don't feel pangs of remorse or guilt. And I said, well, that's a good point. So let's add here freedom from internal conflict and not instigating external conflict. Now, I don't have it on the board because I didn't have space to put it, but very clearly, we don't want to be instigating external conflict either. So order versus disorder. What's disorder? Sustained internal conflict. Now, the important word here, sustained, needs an explanation. Sustained internal conflict. It's called sustained because when we get these feelings here, there's an internal state of conflict. They're disturbing feelings. And when you understand the function, you can accept these feelings. If you don't work the feelings, work the system, understand where the change needs to happen, the feelings become sustained. The disturbing feeling keeps on going and going. And again, that's where the suffering comes in. Right? So disorder is present when there's sustained internal conflict. Okay. So let's compare these two paradigms further. When we're making a decision about whether or not something brings about or sustains order, and I want to write that down. Here the decision is, does this bring me pleasure or does this bring me pain? In paradigm 1. Here it is, so this would be, does thinking or taking an action, does thinking this create or sustain order in my life? Or disorder? That's the question that goes with paradigm 2. So when we're making a decision here about whether or not a thought or an action creates or sustains order or disorder, we're not looking at only our own experience as we do in paradigm 1. This becomes a we-us proposition. Now, why is that said? Well, let's go back to chapter 1 again, and the third question of the editor, which is, does thinking or doing this contribute to my well-being and the well-being of those around me? And we explained back then, we don't live in a vacuum, we don't live in isolation, we are always part of community, we are always connected with others. So that's why it's a we-us proposition, not just a me-only proposition. Okay? And that's because we are always living in community, we are not living in isolation. So I want to give an example of this as well. And we're going to use substance abuse again. So here we have a heroin addict who's living in an abandoned building, shooting up, and the neighbors passing by start to feel really uncomfortable. In fact, as they pass by, they can kind of smell something that doesn't smell so great or so good. And then they see this fellow coming in and out who looks rather disheveled. So they call the police. And the police come and they find the fellow sitting there on the floor. And he's got needles all around and powder and vomit and other things. And they come up to him and say, hi fella, how you doing? And he says, officer, I'm doing fine. Everything's just wonderful, no problem. And the officer says, well, I'm not sure that there isn't a problem. You know, other people might be concerned. Oh, officer, I don't have any family, don't have any friends, it's just me. I'm not bothering anybody. It's just me, I'm alone. There's no problem. So you can relax. And the officer says to him, well, I don't know that, you know, you're totally alone like that, like you're getting your supplies here from somebody and they're getting them from somebody, so you're part of a group of people, you know, that deal in the drugs here. So I'm not going to tell you where I'm getting them from. Well, you don't need to tell me. I'm just pointing out that you're not really alone. You think you're alone. And then, by the way, the neighbors called, right? And they're concerned. And the way you're looking right now, by law, I have to call an ambulance because I don't know that you're going to make it, fella. You're looking so pale and sick right now. And who do you think's paying for the ambulance? Well, not me. I don't have any money for that. Well, your neighbors. My point is, you're not alone. You think you're alone, but you're not alone. Okay? So we're always a member of community. It's always a we-us decision making. And I want to come back to community in a moment, but before we go there, I want to point out another difference. Here, this is a now only. It's my immediate experience. What's going to give me pleasure, what's going to give me pain. Over here, if we go into chapter 4, we know that the future comes out of now, and that the past contributes to the now. The now is a combination of what's existed in the past and what's new in the present. And if we want to have a positive future, and we had a positive past in that area, we just bring that positive past into the now. No problem. But if we want a positive future, and we have a negative past, where does that future come from? Chapter 4 on time? It doesn't come from the past. It comes from the present. So if I want a future different from the past, the only way I can do that is by changing what I'm doing, thinking, or doing now in the present. So what I need to do here is I need to bring my future intention into the now and not carry my past forward through time. Okay, so that's another difference. This is now only, this is now, knowing it's going to give me my future, learning from the past, and deciding if I want a future different from the past, how do I do that now? If I say I'll do it tomorrow I'm going to say I'll do it tomorrow, and so on. It has to change now. We went through that in the chapter on time. So I want to talk a little bit more about community and some scientific proof about the fact that we are never alone. It's an idea that we're alone or can be alone that runs against the reality that science helps us see. Before we go there, thoughts, comments, questions? If not, we can go on.
I'll come up with it again. So, yeah, this idea of community I think is really interesting. And this idea that, that we're always connected, right?
Right.
We're always connected in some way.
Yes, it's only an idea that has us feeling separate.
Right. Right. Yeah, and I think of just what's current in our society today, right? Loneliness has increasingly gone up.
Yeah.
It's one of social work's kind of grand challenges, right? And if we look at really break down that experience of loneliness, we begin to understand what that's all about, right?
Sure.
But
we have some ideas that are getting in the way of seeing what is.
right, exactly. That sort of get carried forth.
Yeah.
Right. And I am curious about that. Of how do we get back to not only knowing that but feeling that. Right, like what's the embodiment practice of because that to me that is truth, that we are all connected in ways that we can't even perceive with our senses.
Right. Well, we often don't feel that. We feel lonely because disconnected because we're not feeling understood.
Right.
And if we're listened to in a way that validates our experience, whether subjective or objective, validates the experience, then we start to feel part of or related to, which is one of the great benefits of therapy, good therapy, is that we're sitting there with a person who shows interest and gives us a sense of value and helps us feel connected and related.
Right.
One of Carl Jung's interesting statements was that the therapeutic effect is less a matter of the technique that's being used or the orientation. It's more a matter of the personality of the therapist.
Right.
Meaning the capacity to sense a meaningful connection, bond, and interest in person's experience.
Right. Totally agree with that. And I think my last thing on community and loneliness is the subjective nature of loneliness. How I can be in the middle of nowhere, in the desert or in the forest, nobody is around for miles but feel so connected.
Yeah.
And on the other end, I can be living in the busiest block in New York City, surrounded by people, but have this aching loneliness in my heart, right? So it's so subjective. It's not really dependent on amount of people you're close to.
Right.
It's that unique subjective experience of connection.
Yes, it's not a matter of being alone.
Right.
As you pointed out, you can be alone in the desert, in the mountains or trails, and feel very connected to life.
Right.
And be around other people and feel the disconnect. Yes.
Right.
It's an internal subjective way that we interpret our sense of relationship.
Exactly. Love that.
Yes.
Well, thank you again.
All right, thank you.
Beautiful.
Right. So now we're going to take a little scientific look at the idea that we're never alone, we're always part of community. So to do that, we're going to go back in time 13.8 billion years, 13.8 billion years to what we now understand to be the origin of this universe, the Big Bang. So this took place 13.8 billion years ago, and the Big Bang involved an explosion of particles from, I guess what we would say is non-matter, non-material. The only thing that I know that exists that is non-matter is energy. That's the term we use for energy, which is a potentiality for action or movement. Okay, so out of that energy, these particles exploded out. And as the particles combine, we end up with the first of the elements called helium. And then through a process of heating and cooling, hydrogen, not helium. So we start with hydrogen, and then through heating and cooling, all of a sudden now we have helium. And then the hydrogen and helium interact with each other, and the gases combined start to create our sun and the stars. Okay. On the interior of the stars, now we have this furnace activity going on, which creates carbon and nitrogen and then oxygen. So these 5 elements here existed in the first 500 million years of the universe, the 0.5 billion years of the universe. So the universe begins with these, and by the way, there's another 2 in here, lithium and neon, but those are inert gases that don't have very much to do with anything on our planet at this time other than lithium and mood. So what we're going to do is follow through time, this 13.8 billion years, up to the point where our sun is born. The sun is born 5 billion years ago. 500 million years after that, the earth is formed. And then another billion years after that, we have the first life occurring in the oceans and single-cell organisms like bacteria. And then over another 2 billion years plus, we end up with plants on the earth, goes from the ocean onto land. And then if we fast forward down there to about 225 million years ago, we have the beginning of the dinosaurs. Fast forward there, about 50 million years ago, we have the beginning of the animals as we know them today. And we fast forward to the last 2.5 billion years, which, by the way, on the cosmic clock of 24 hours is just a few seconds before midnight. So we are the new ones on the planet here. And our subspecies about 250,000 years. Okay, so it all came from beginning with these 5 elements. These are essential to life. There's 11 elements that are essential to all life, but these 5 here are the building blocks. So coming all the way down here to the human being, we can then come up with this idea and this principle that human beings are organisms, like any other organism. Organisms are made up of a grouping of organs working together for its own survival, and it reproduces, it utilizes the energy of the environment to sustain itself and so on. So those organs are working together to continue the organism through life. The organs are made up of tissue. Tissue is made up of cells. Cells are made up of organelles. Organelles are made up of molecules, and molecules are made up of atoms. Okay? So when you think about it, the human being, and among all organisms, are really atomic beings. We're made up of atoms. And whether the atoms in the human body, 63% of them are hydrogen. We don't have any helium in the body. The next highest percentage of atoms is oxygen atoms. And you think of H2O, water, and we're largely water. It makes sense that you have more hydrogen than oxygen atoms in the body. And then the next is carbon, and then the next is nitrogen. So these 4 out of the 5 make up 99% of the atoms in the human body. Trillions and trillions and trillions of atoms that combine to make molecules, and then cells, and then tissue, and then organs. Okay? So look at that. All those atoms are right here in the first 500 million years of the universe. all that's happened is that these atoms have formed elements and combined with each other to produce organisms. So what this shows is that we are not part of the universe. We are the universe in a particular time-space point. You are largely hydrogen atoms. And there's an interesting little meditation that involves picturing yourself becoming so tiny that you can sit in the center of the hydrogen atoms in your body. So what is a hydrogen atom? Well, you have a nucleus, the center of the atom, and it's only one proton. And then you have an electron, which is circling around it, like that. So it's largely empty space, okay? If you've ever been into a large basilica or a huge building, to get an idea of the space in an atom, think of a grain of sand being held in the middle of that building. And then that's the nucleus, and then the electron is going around the ceiling and the floor and the walls. So they're largely empty space. The human body is 99.99999999999% empty space. It's just that we don't see it with our eyes. We don't have atomic microscopes for the eyes. And because of the energy bonds in those atoms, it feels like it's solid, but it's not really solid. It is empty space. It's just that the atoms have these energy bonds that don't allow the transfer through. The point being made, very simply, is that you are the universe in a particular time-space point. So how can you be alone? It's impossible. You can only think that you're alone. And when you think you're alone, you get a disturbing feeling. And when you get that disturbing feeling, that tells you you've got a thought arguing with reality. You need to change the thought to be in line with reality, or what is. That you are the universe. Now, other people would say, from the religious perspective, that you are the divine, you are the sacred, and so on. And that has its place. But what we're looking at now is just the scientific understanding of the fact that we are never alone. So here's the proof that we are always in community. And whatever action we take, it's going to influence those around us, and not immediately, some point down the road. So you want to intelligently contribute to your well-being and the well-being of those around you. The third question of the editor from chapter 1. One other thing I want to bring up is about consciousness. Okay, so we begin with energy, right? We said back here in the beginning there was just energy, what we call non-material being, which sounds strange. So we begin with energy, and we know the existence of energy through the relationship of the particles in atoms, how they dance around each other. Those atoms then, and here I put hydrogen and oxygen, two different elements or atoms, those atoms combine to create molecules. And here in this example we have a H2O, or a water molecule, which is two hydrogen atoms combined with an oxygen atom. Those molecules, as we said before, create cells that then become tissue, then become organisms, and through evolution, these organisms create a consciousness of their experiencing in their environment. At what we think is the highest level, we don't know for sure that human beings are the most intelligent or most aware animals on the planet. The whales, some of the whales have a brain that's 5 times larger than human beings, so we don't know. We don't speak their language. But what we have here is a consciousness that then starts to reflect on itself, who or what it is in its environment. We form concepts, different ideas, and out of those principles and so on. So that consciousness studies itself as an organism through biology. We understand biology through understanding chemistry, the smaller parts, and in chemistry, understanding through physics. And then I bring it back down here to spirituality. Why do I call that spirituality? Because spirituality, in the simplest definition, is the awareness that I am a part of the totality, that I am part of the whole, that everybody is. Everything is. This is where the indigenous peoples have it more right than the Western culture. when they talk about the winged people, or the four-legged, or the tree people, and they honor the elements, the rocks, the water. There's a sense of being a part of the totality. Okay, so for now we can say, that we're all a part. Spirituality says that I am a part of the totality, and therefore I'm going to make my decisions in a way that's always involving a we or us, because I'm concerned with the environment that I live in. And I'm always going to be taking a look at what I do now, because that's going to turn into my future. And all of that is done with this reference. So, thoughts, comments, questions? No?
Love
Okay.
it.
Yeah,
So-
I have a question real
Yeah.
quick. And this might be a silly question, but
Then I'll give you a silly answer.
and I would love that. And so that question, does blank create or sustain order in my life or disorder? Order or disorder in my life, correct?
Yes.
Can it be that even though something is beneficial for you to do, it can create some disorder that could lead to order? Or is it like very kind of disordered order? Does that make sense?
Well, since
Yeah.
disorder is sustained internal conflict,
Mm-hmm.
there are times when we can take an action that does lead to apparent disorder, but as part of the process, this is where we go back into chapter 2, process versus conclusive thinking, right? Because something apparently bad or negative occurs as a result of an action doesn't mean that that's the end point.
Mm-hmm.
That might be part of a process that's going to move it into some better direction. I can learn from my pain, I can learn from the mistakes, I can learn from the suffering,
Mm-hmm.
and then carry that forward.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, like we talked about in chapter 2, when we looked at guilt as a label versus guilt as a feeling. So guilt as a label is conclusive thinking, right? And it's always a dead end, negative going nowhere, leads to
Mhm.
depression or anxiety. Guilt as a feeling will take that same incident that produced, the guilt, that's conclusive of blaming myself, and say, okay, that's a negative, but it doesn't have to stay negative. What's needed to turn it into the positive? What will move it in some better direction?
Mm-hmm.
So, is that answering
Yeah,
your
it does answer.
question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Now, when you said that, that reminded me of something. Oh, yes. I was going through this with somebody 15 years ago. And I was driving into work. At that time, I was living in Chicago, and I was driving into the office from my home. And I was going through something extremely painful. And I was very sad. And I was working through my sadness. And then I decided to ask myself, gee, am I a happy person, even though I'm now sad? And my answer was yes. How could I be happy and sad at the same time? Well, I was free from internal conflict having my sadness, because I was working the sadness to understand where my thinking was off and I needed to make the adjustment. So it seems like, oh, sadness is a bad thing. No, sadness was part of that whole process of expanding the consciousness into seeing things with a greater sense of objectivity and reality. Okay. Which brings us to the main point here. Well, what makes this thing so important about order and disorder? When I have order in my life, I could say I'm a happy person, or there's happiness there. There's nothing to keep me from being happy if I have a sense of internal order, right? So I would posit that the natural state of the human being, feeling state of the human being, is one of happiness.
Mm.
And we're all trying to get to that place of happiness, except we have a problem, a huge problem, especially in our Western culture and modern society. We make this big mistake of confusing pleasure and happiness.
Mm-hmm.
We think that pleasure and happiness are the same thing. And here we would say that pleasure to the nth degree does not equal happiness. Okay? It's a huge confusion. Our society is hyper-focused on pleasure, and it comes at the expense of happiness, because too often we are using pleasure to try to cover the pain, simply because we don't understand the positive function of these feelings. Okay? So, when we take a look at happiness, happiness is based on freedom from internal conflict, which comes from values and meanings. Whether the values, operating as a member of community, whether the meanings, understanding the true function of these feelings. Okay? So happiness arises from order that's based on values and meanings. What's going here in paradigm 1 is quite different. These feelings involve physical sensations in the body. Okay? And so this paradigm is largely based on what we call transient biological states. Okay? That's different from working from a place of values and meanings. Okay, now one thing I have up here is I have paradigm 1 versus paradigm 2, which is a misconception. It's not versus, it's and. Why do we say and? Because this is instinctual, it's going to operate. This is a higher cognitive order of making decisions and going through life. Okay, so both of these operate. So where is the problem though? There is a versus here, and this is what it is. When we operate from paradigm 2, we're operating from intelligence and love. And again, we're going to have arrows pointing to the same places as values and meanings. This intelligence, what's the main intelligence? I understand the function of these feelings. I know that no word, statement, event, situation, or person ever creates a feeling in me. It's the interpretation that the brain gives based on its social conditioning. In my history of learning from other people who don't yet understand themselves and how we're built and how this all operates. So we can carry that ignorance forward. So the intelligence is about the positive function of these feelings. Where does love come in? Comes back to community. That I value the environment that I live in. And I value the people in that environment. And the animals in that environment. And the plants. And the elements in the earth. Everything. It's no longer divided. It's one whole, one ecological whole. I am not separate from the universe. I am the universe in a particular time-space point. There's a beautiful energy comes when you realize that. So, where's the problem here? Ignorance and fear. Where's the ignorance? Ignorance of the function of the feelings. Where is the fear? Fear of the feelings. So it's ignorance and fear versus intelligence and love. That's the place that all religions have been trying to take us for millennia. And all we're doing here is we're using a little bit of, first of all, the understanding of the function of these feelings. That's why the book is called All Feelings Are Good and Right, A Guide to Intelligent Living. It's all based on understanding this mechanism that we're built with. Okay? So it's understanding the function of these feelings, rational, a little bit of logic, and then a little bit of science. So logic and science can take us to the same place that religions have been trying to take us to with the rituals and the practices and the dogmas. We might say that perhaps the philosophy that exists in the world at this time, the one that comes closest to this would be Taoist philosophy. Very much in line with these principles. So this is basically it. How do we make our decisions? Do we make them intelligently with a sense of connection and compassion and love? Or do we make them out of ignorance and fear? I hope this helps you to live from a place of intelligence and love. Thank you.
Thank you.